Runaway gaps are found in the middle of a trend move, typically after prices have already had a strong solid run, usually on a smaller intraday time frame. Runaway gaps offer continuation of this previous price move, so hence they're often called a continuation gap or sometimes even a measuring gap. Support and resistance levels in runaway gaps work the same way that they do in the other forms of gaps. For instance, the closure of the gap itself will offer support, but runaway gaps have a more difficult time continuing a move after the gap has closed. So even though you might experience a closure of the gap in the morning, typically a runaway gap will then reverse course intraday and continue in the direction of the larger gap itself. In this chart of Royal Gold Incorporated, RGLD, there's a number of examples of runaway gaps. The first takes place after a breakout of this congestion heading into the end of June and going into the beginning of July. There's an initial gap here taking place on June 30th, and this is followed by a runaway gap the next day into July 1st. Even though RGLD did pull down about 50% of the gap itself, it still held that upper range and then reversed course, continuing higher throughout most of the session to close near the day's highs. A second example of this type of runaway gap takes place in the middle of July. There's a breakaway gap here, which is followed by a runaway gap the next day. In this case, again, we have the larger break with a gap higher. This time, the gap has a little bit better of a time closing. However, the closure of that gap itself serves as support and allows the security to again reverse, heading higher into the end of the day so that it closed very closely to the highs of that session. Even though the day begins on July 22nd, as if we have another example of a runaway gap, notice that in this case the gap actually ends up closing and continuing. This type of gap is referred to as an exhaustion gap, and it is a fourth style of gap. Usually the difference between an exhaustion gap and a runaway gap is based upon the type of action which occurs intraday. So, looking at the daily chart alone, just merely at opening price action, is not the best way to determine whether a gap is going to serve as a runaway gap or an exhaustion gap. You need to look at the intraday action as well. It can, however, offer you a number of great stocks to put on your watch list at the beginning of the trading day because gaps such as this will often go on to have really strong trend moves throughout the session. If you'd like to learn more about gap analysis, be sure to check out my website, ToniHansen.com, or go to www.tradingfrommainstreet.com. I can also be reached through my email at Toni@tradingfrommainstreet.com.